if you asked most Americans, do you feel better off than you were 100 days ago? They would say no, and that is why consumer confidence in America is very weak. That is why, most Americans and most American households, most American businesses looking at that 100 days economic document would say this is not reflecting remotely the reality and the uncertainty that's been created by the Trump presidency.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by the Sunday Times' economic editor, David Smith. David, thanks for joining me today.
Not at all. My pleasure.
Marking Donald Trump's first 100 days in office on his second term, the White House has released what it calls Trump's economic policy wins. First among these is jobs. They say President Trump has created 345,000 jobs since taking office in January. Where is the Trump administration on employment?
I think the jobs numbers have been slightly better than expected, I think, because although they're not strong by recent American standards, although that the 100 days document does suggest that it's better than under Joe Biden, but the numbers aren't particularly strong, but they are somewhat better than expected because I think people didn't really know what damage Elon Musk has been doing with his Department of Government Efficiency, the DOGE cuts, and mainly they haven't come through in terms of the big numbers, the macro numbers for jobs. Mainly because I think that is because people have been put on notice that their jobs will disappear rather than them necessarily disappearing from the payroll. So I think that is still to come. The jobs numbers are not terrible; they're not great, but that is not a particular. I don't blame the White House for that particular bit of the 100 days document. It's the jobs numbers have been okay. Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
And as you say, they've made a point in this document of saying 15,000 federal government jobs have been cut. That's presumably all part of the efforts of Elon Musk's DOGE. They might have been somewhat saved by the bell then, by the sounds of things, in that a lot of the impact of that isn't going to be felt until later in the year or perhaps later in the presidency.
Yeah, I think the saved by the bell theme is rather a good one to explore, because I think there are many things in which things are going to get worse later, and that will include employment. Now, if you look at this from the perspective of the White House, then they would see, fewer federal jobs, closure of the Department of Education, closure of many USAID programs, most USAID programs, as the kind of thing they were looking for. So this is the kind of draining of the swamp of Washington. But for most ordinary people, including some Republican voters who didn't expect to see their jobs disappear almost immediately, this is going to be bad news. So I think it'll be a mixed picture. Trump supporters will see fewer government jobs as good news. I think for the wider economy, it's probably not that good news. But so far, as I say, it is pain deferred, I think, on employment. And if the economy slows as it is expected to do, then of course you would expect that also to be reflected in a lower rate of job creation. I don't think America is heading for a huge unemployment shock. It's been as in the UK, the job market has been pretty tight since COVID. A lot of people left the labour force during COVID, so I think there is enough momentum there to prevent disaster in the job market. But I think there will be pain later, but not in the first 100 days.
And where else are those quite significant federal cuts by DOGE going to have an impact on America's economy?
Well, I think the biggest impact of the cuts will come with. There's already been an effect in terms of what you might call American soft power from the cuts in the aid program, but I think the moment you get bad things happening in America, so storms, hurricanes, that kind of thing, which requires federal help, the federal emergency service essentially, but also, when we saw, very early on in the Trump presidency, the plane crash in in Washington, that was regarded. That people started to look straight away. How much of this is due to the fact that they've been indiscriminately cutting jobs that might involve safety, might involve support for people. So I think the danger will come later. Now, if government needs to be efficient, it needs to be effective. But if you cut too much too quickly, the great risk is then that backfires and people will start to blame you when things go wrong. And I think that is a danger that for the Trump administration in that respect. It's not particularly the case that America relies on public sector jobs, as much as we do in the UK, as much as most European countries do. So I think the private sector will always be the engine of job creation in the US, but there are those risks there. If you cut anything too quickly, the danger, and some of these cuts have been pretty indiscriminate under Musk. There is a risk that you endanger the things that people value, and that will backfire on the administration, I think, if that happens.
I mean, inflation as well has been a major campaign issue for the Trump administration and for Trump on the campaign. We all remember J.D. Vance's photo op in front of those shelves of eggs. While they claim they've halved egg prices and brought down prices on prescription drugs and energy, what impact do you think Trump has had so far on inflation? Is that a win for him?
Definitely not. No, I mean the egg thing. If you read that 100 Days document, it is a masterwork of selective statistics, because the fact is egg prices are high and have risen very substantially, not just over the past year, but since January. And the document talks about wholesale prices starting to fall, and saying that in the next couple of months that will be reflected in retail prices. But as far as it's never had the impact in the UK as it has in America. I mean, obviously they eat a lot more eggs there than we do, I think, or it's just one of those. Gas prices, petrol prices to us are a trigger point in America, but so are egg prices, and egg prices have just continued to rise very strongly. Initially it was thought to be the effect of bird flu. But that seems to have faded as a factor now. But the egg prices are still rising quite strongly and continue to do so, whatever that document says. They're still very high, still rising very strongly. And I think in March we're up, something like 20 or 30% on January. So it's still a factor. Inflation. Again, and I think we're going to be talking about this theme quite a lot. It's the danger to come in inflation. The White House has scolded Amazon for threatening to put the tariff effect on its prices. Amazon denies it ever had any such plan, but people will see the effect of tariffs on the prices they pay in future. And also, the wider point is, incumbent governments all over the world have suffered from the inflation that we saw post-pandemic, the inflation that was partly as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I think to suggest that was somehow, the effect of, Joe Biden's mismanagement, or even, here Rishi Sunak's mismanagement is stretching it a bit. This was going to happen. We saw a big increase in global energy prices, a big increase in food prices because shipments from Ukraine and Russia were cut back. So this was just an international effect, and comparisons with the Biden years will always be favourable, even as the tariff effect hits, because there were special factors in that period. But the inflation performance has not been great so far, and is bound, I think, to get worse, which is one reason why the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, is very cautious about cutting interest rates, despite the pressure from Trump to do so. So I think the inflation bit of that 100 Days report from the White House was a masterpiece of selective use of statistics.
Well, I do want to come on to some of the references to previous administrations in this document, but on inflation, is there at least a victory that Trump can draw from dropping energy and oil prices?
Well, I think the only victory there I can see is that the reason that global oil prices have come down is because of the fear that Trump's tariffs will lead to a world recession. And so that is, is that a victory? It's certainly a Pyrrhic victory, I would say. I think world recession is probably stretching it a little bit, because I think he will, he will draw back from the tariffs before we get to that point. But you've seen, all over the world, economic forecasts for growth have been revised down. The IMF recently took up quite a bit off its global growth forecast in its latest World Economic Outlook. That is the reason why global energy prices have come down. It's nothing to do with great economic management. It's to do with the fears that his mismanagement and the misplaced tariffs will lead to slower global growth, slower U.S. growth. I mean, if you say that having the major investment banks, Goldman Sachs saying there's a 40% chance of a U.S. recession, Morgan Stanley, I think, saying a 60% chance, then that doesn't look like a big win to me, if that's the reason why energy prices have come down, and it is the reason.
And as you say, I mean, even in this document, Trump continues to heap blame on the previous administration, on Biden for and comparing things like inflation with how he's done so far in his presidency. There's no sign of him letting up on that criticism of previous administrations, is there? That's going to be a core part of any policy announcement that Trump makes.
No, there isn't. And we're talking just now about jobs, and the jobs are a lagging indicator, and the whatever has happened to, apart from some cuts in government employment at the margin, most of what has happened to employment and to job creation in the early months of the Trump presidency reflects the afterglow of what was happening under Biden. It doesn't turn around. Economies don't turn on a sixpence. So this is the follow through from the good growth that was achieved under the previous president. What he won't mention is, when we look at this, we from a UK perspective, we're rather surprised by it. But I was looking at the figures yesterday for the G7 economies, the world's biggest economies, and since the eve of the pandemic, at the end of 2019, US economic growth has exceeded the other G7 countries by a considerable margin. The US economy has grown by a cumulative 12% since the eve of the pandemic. We've, in the UK, have grown by just over 3%. Germany hasn't grown at all. The others are bunched in between that. And, I was saying to some people recently that it's proof that, economists always go on about GDP and growth and so on. And, our government here is always obsessing about growth. But what that shows to me is that when it comes to consumers, when it comes to voters, inflation mattered more than growth. Growth is something, almost, they can see it reported, but how does it affect them? The way that it affects them and the way they think about it is what's happened to my wage packet. If their wage packet has been squeezed by inflation, that is more important than this kind of slightly difficult to grasp concept of growth. And if the growth is unevenly spread as well, which is always a thing in big economies like America, then they're much more concerned with how much they're paying at the supermarket, what's happening to their gas prices, what's happening to their egg prices, and all those things, than this thing about growth. But the growth performance of the Biden administration was actually very good, and I think we're just seeing a little bit of follow through from that. The exception to that is that the fear of the tariffs does appear to have led to a big increase in imports during the first 3 months of the year. And, the US trade deficit, Trump is always talking about eliminating the trade gap because America is being ripped off by the rest of the world. But the US trade gap, because of a surge in imports to beat the tariffs, looks to have reached record levels in the first, in the early months of his presidency, which is not part of the plan at all. So I think that is one thing which is not carried over from the Biden administration, but a lot of the other stuff was. And we'll only see, the true picture of what's happening under Donald Trump, not in the first 100 days, but maybe if we look back after 300 days, we might get a better idea.
So, in a sense, then, at least thus far, those tariff or threats of tariffs, I suppose, at this point, have kind of backfired.
They have backfired, and they will continue to backfire. And I think I don't know what Trump expected in when he made his Liberation Day announcements. I think he really did mean it. I think he thought that this was something that could happen and was fair, and the rest of the world would either accept it as fair or come along very quickly and seek to negotiate trade deals with him. I think the rest of the world instead looked pretty askance at these announcements, and they knew it. The reciprocal tariffs were based on made up numbers, misuse of a statistical formula, weren't based on reality at all. Now, what we'll be left with at the end of this process, Trump has recently, as part of his 100-day celebrations, if you like, he went to Detroit and announced some paring back of the tariffs on cars and car parts imported into the US. I think we'll see, a process of withdrawal of those. I mean, it was always a completely bonkers, misplaced approach. There was one thing one idea you could have, and was very much his first term obsession, was that China engages in unfair trade practices. China, steals other people's technology and all those things. So, we need to get to China. China is America's great rival for global economic dominance. But then to have such a scattergun approach and to hit everybody with tariffs seems to me to be, even if you think tariffs are a good weapon to use, you don't apply them to everybody, because that way you then you don't have a collective mission, from the rest of the world against China. What you have got is everybody is fed up with America, and everybody is reacting against America. And the 90-day pause after the Liberation Day has taken away one of the weapons that could have been used quite effectively against China. In the first term, China was able to divert production to countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and then export to America that way. This time, China, those countries were hit on Liberation Day, April the 2nd, with quite high tariffs to prevent that from happening. But they've now been withdrawn. It's not clear how many electronic iPhones and all those things will be subject to tariffs. It's a complete mess. And, not only did it never deserve to succeed, but it deserves to fail spectacularly. And I very much hope it does.
And, they do also list things like real average hourly earnings for middle and low income workers is what they've written down here. They say that's up 0.4% and 1% for workers in the manufacturing sector. I mean, is there anything like that in this document that is going to be felt by voters and help give Trump a kind of boost in the polls?
Well, I think this is it takes time. If you look in the UK, as the Office for National Statistics has said for some time, real average earnings have been rising for something like 18 months now. But people still feel the inflation that was there in the past, and and we've just had in the UK, April in which lots and lots of administered prices, broadband, mobile phones, water bills, council tax, all went up, and people still think, well, everywhere I look, prices are rising, and I think it's a bit like that in America. As a simple statistical point, it is the case there as here that wages are outstripping prices at the moment. But it's and for as long as I've been writing about the economy, which is a long time, I always know people always notice prices when they're rising. They don't know the many prices that are not rising or even falling. The thing that affects them is I went into the so and so recently, and 2 weeks ago the price was so and so. This week it's 10% higher than that, or their car insurance has gone up, or their council tax has gone up. All those things. People have a what you might call an asymmetrical approach to prices. Those that stay the same, they don't notice. those that go up, they do notice. And people in America are the same as people here. They notice the rising prices, eggs and so on, and the gas prices have come down a bit, which is good. But they're still, Americans still think gas prices, which we would regard as a steal, are still too high by their standards. So it still costs too much to fill up the pickup truck, and not many Trump supporters drive Tesla, so they don't notice how much electricity costs to charge up the car. But Americans are still feeling the squeeze of the high inflation that we had in the past, despite those figures, I think. But in time, if you come back to that question, and it doesn't arise for some time, but it's the Ronald Reagan question. Do you feel better off than you were 4 years ago? Nobody's going to say, if you asked most Americans, do you feel better off than you were 100 days ago? They would say no, and that is why consumer confidence in America is very weak. That is why, most Americans and most American households, most American businesses looking at that 100 days economic document would say, this is not reflecting remotely the reality and the uncertainty that's been created by the Trump presidency.
Well, David Smith, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.